Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Jessie Wong. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm part of the SheEO team as the Director of Activator Growth and an activator myself. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land that I'm on. I now live, work, and play in Detroit, Michigan, the ancestral and contemporary homelands of three Anishinaabe nations, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. These three tribes came to the Great Lakes thousands of years ago and were known as the Council of Three Fires. The Ojibwe are the keepers of the faith, the Odawa, the keepers of trade, and the Potawatomi, the keepers of the fire. As Asian Canadians and Asian Americans, we are settlers on Indigenous land and have benefited greatly from it. And our story on this land is one that echoes the oppression, the erasure, and systemic racism that Indigenous people face. As we work to address the rise of anti-Asian racism, we stand in solidarity with all Indigenous, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, and Maori peoples around the world, with Black Lives Matter, and with all people of color in dismantling systems of white supremacy. As Maya Angelou said, the truth is, no one of us can be free until everybody is free. Our collective fight will be our collective liberation. Today marks the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, which reignited the call for racial justice and the Black Lives Matter movement around the world. The month of May is also Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Following the spread of COVID-19 last year, there's been a dramatic rise in hate crimes and violence against Asian people. There have been over 5,000 anti-Asian hate crimes in the last year in the US and Canada. 5,000 Asian Americans and Canadians who have been harassed, assaulted, spat on, slashed, shoved to the ground, and worse. And those are just the incidents that were reported. After writing a SheEO newsletter about anti-Asian racism and some of the conversations that we'd had on our team, I was really moved to receive dozens of responses from our community. White women who reached out and committed to examining their racial biases and to being better allies. Asian women who felt seen and heard. One such woman who reached out was Janice Fukakusa, our SheEO board chair, corporate director, and truly one of the most powerful women in Canada. We had a call and she shared the incredible work she's been doing over the last year to combat anti-Asian racism in Canada. And we had the idea to co-create today's learning circle. When thinking of who else to reach out to in the community, I remembered Suzanne Siemens, an activator and a venture, had made a very powerful post on her social media platforms about anti-Asian racism, a post that in turn inspired me to start sharing out loud as well. And that Chenny Xia, another activator and venture who hosts our weekly Canadian calls within the SheEO community, that a few weeks ago, she had arrived to host one of these calls, having just been harassed on the street. So today, Janice, Chenny, Suzanne, and I are here for this conversation with you all. We're going to start by sharing our personal stories and experiences. We'll then discuss the systems and the history that led us to where we are today. And we'll close with what actions we can take going forward in our families, in our communities, and in our workplaces. This may be new for a lot of you, so I invite you to use this opportunity to learn from our stories and to sit in the discomfort. We hope our conversation today will help raise awareness about anti-Asian racism, inspire you to look inward and to take action. Please note that what we are going to share today is based on our personal experiences, our lived experiences, and is by no means encompassing of the diverse experiences of all Asians and Pacific Islanders. And like you're already starting to do, please continue to share your questions and comments in the chat throughout. We'd love to hear how you're feeling. And with that, it's my pleasure to first pass it to Suzanne, who is going to introduce herself and share her personal story. Over to you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Jessie, and hi, everyone. Well, first, thanks for convening this conversation. I really felt strongly compelled to participate in it because I had the benefit of participating in the SheEO Racial Justice Working Group and had the benefit of listening to Wakumi Douglas and hearing stories from her and her insights and education in that journey. And I felt that I had something to contribute as well. So this is a really great opportunity for me to share my journey in terms of I grew up in an environment where, you know, my parents indirectly, unknowingly taught me about the model minority and that we should work hard, keep our heads down, and not cause trouble. I remember that phrase so often. My father would say, like, don't cause trouble. And in witnessing the growth in the anti-Asian hate crimes, I was just feeling incensed and feeling like I can't stay quiet anymore. This is wrong. And I think that the Atlanta murders of primarily Asian women just kind of put me over the top and said, I can't be quiet. And this needs to be raised. I need to use my voice and my platform in whatever way I can to express my concern and express my own personal journey. And then I got even angrier when I saw that the elderly woman from Oakland, California, Zhao Zhenji, she was attacked. And when you heard her speaking about how she was attacked, she spoke in my mom's dialect, and that broke me. That literally broke me because she sounded like her, and she sounded like all the aunties and grandmas that I know. And it made me realize this has to stop. What can I do? How can I change that? So I'm ditching the model minority myth and saying, like, that only serves to keep us quiet, and it serves only to support these white supremacist systems that have always been in place. And I will talk later about some of those systems that have harmed my family and what we grew up with. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I'm already regretting being spotlighted as I cry listening to everyone's stories. Janice, I'm going to pass it to you next.
And thank you, Jessie, too, for organizing this. I'm really happy that we can all speak and share our own experiences and hopefully learn from each other on what we're talking about. So I'd like to just talk a bit about when I started this journey about anti-Asian racism. So last year in March, I went to a fast food restaurant with my husband, who is not Asian. And remember, around March is when we started with the lockdowns and all of that. So it was just before that. So he went to order and I went to get a table. And as I was sitting down, there were someone at the next table said very loudly, "Coronavirus," just walked in and sat down right beside us in a very angry voice. I immediately froze. I was shocked, and I said to my husband, "We're leaving right now." And in my head, I said what I've always been told and what I grew up with, which is let it go, walk away, don't make a fuss. Very similar, Suzanne, to your experience. And it just comes right back to you when you're threatened like that. But it was on my mind for several weeks after that, as I listened to the violent incidents against our elders. And it's mostly against the elders or people who really can't do anything. And I thought to myself, anti-Asian racism has popped up again. It's systemic. Every time something like this happens, it popped up. So, and I have to do something about it now because I just couldn't get that out of my head. So I spoke to some friends from across Canada about how given the escalating violence, what can we do about this? Because we have to do something. And because it is systemic, we have to think about what that longer term journey is and how we can actually attack the fact that it's systemic, as well as give help to everyone who is being subjected to these attacks. So we formed a group, which is, it's with leaders, business and community leaders across Canada. And our intent is and was then to speak out, combine resources, and try to change the dialogue. So, so we started out with the awareness, and we actually developed a guide of what to do if you have, if you're subject to any hate crime. And it's a guide that, and I'm Chancellor of Ryerson right now, so I did it through Ryerson with my group and some other resources, which actually you go into, and if anything happens to you, it's a resource guide that can direct you to any information you need. And it's in the resource thing at the end, I think, Jesse, right? And direct you to what to do. And so we were working with that we launched that actually last September, and then started to work on all the awareness education. But what happened this spring is the incidents started to spike up again. They spiked up really high. So we thought, well, in May, it's Asian Heritage Month that Jesse spoke about. And why don't we use that to actually raise the awareness again? Because obviously we're not getting the message out to all Canadians. So I want to just show you a video that we launched 2 weeks ago. It's one of a series of videos through a social media campaign that is about raising awareness, because this isn't just an Asian Canadian issue. This is a Canadian issue. And so, Jesse, can we cue the video, or Renee? Oh, next. Thank you.
We have never been a loud people. Our elders always taught us that actions speak louder than words, so we learned to keep our heads down, keep our grades up, keep our kin close, keep our mouths shut. I wonder what it does to a people when they stay quiet for so long. Do they forget their voice? The sound of their stories, the resilience of language? When you are no longer in your motherland, does your mother tongue still sing of home? What work songs lifted our spirits as we built the railroad? What prayers did we whisper as they sent us to camps in the mountains to meditate on all the ways we don't belong to this country? So we stayed quiet. As they burned our Chinatowns down and spit on our grandmas at bus stops, we stayed quiet. As they laughed in our faces and told us to go back where we came from, but they've mistaken our silence for compliance. Looked on our meekness as weakness. See, we, and not the submissive stereotype that's been depicted on silence, on us, they've gotten it twisted. See, silence is golden, as are we. A gradient of yellow to brown, every Koreatown a little Saigon, an act of defiance. Every hunchbacked elder a humble giant. Silence is grace in the triumph, is peace in the riot. Silence is bold, a force. It is the brewing calm before the coming storm, and now the sky is splitting open and the rage is pouring forth, so this is for every kid who has ever tried to pull their nose bridge to make it taller. Every time they mocked us because our eyes are smaller. This is for our elders, both alive and remembered, for their lessons, the tough and the tender. For our full names, past and present, may they be pronounced, may they be respected. For every chink in the national fabric, every nip in the winter wind of prairie towns and northern hamlets coast to coast on stolen land. We are here. We've been here. From takeout joints and internment camps to internships and graduation caps, we are strong. We have pride. We fight. We fall. We rise. And to the ones who say we don't belong, it's them who should open their eyes.
Thanks, Nat, and thank you so much, Janice. So the coalition that Janice formed created that video. Renee has shared the link in the chat. We invite you all to share and amplify that video. It already has 51,000 views and at least 20 of them are from me. Really, really powerful stuff. So thank you so much, Janice. And Chenny, I'll pass it to you to introduce yourself.
Oh God, okay. I'm gonna try not to cry, but it's probably gonna happen. As I was watching that video, I was just like, oh, I know I'm gonna go next and I know I'm going to cry a lot, so it's my warning. So I'm Chenny. I feel like most of you have met me in some capacity through the activator calls, so I will save you the ramble. And so I grew up from the age of 4 in Canada, and one of the main memories of my childhood that I remember is actually my dad coming home one day, and his face was just covered in blood and he had broken glasses, and he said that someone shoved him at the station. And so I basically have tried my entire life to like Westernize as much of myself as I could. I actually didn't even take the time to learn about my own history. So I'm mostly Chinese. I didn't even take the time to learn about my own country's history until recently. And so the event that prompted me to even learn even about my own culture and history was an incident that happened 3 blocks away from my house. So I live in a very privileged neighborhood, by the way. It's called Cabbagetown in Toronto. So like Victorian houses, very cute, very, little. They're like just like a little, cute movie scene. And so I just went out to go get a coffee. That was my plan for the day. I walked 3 blocks away from my house, and just so happened like the day before, I watched a TikTok video where someone said, if you think someone is following you, cross the street. And then if they continue to follow you, cross the street again. And then if they do that twice, then like run, essentially. So yeah, so I sensed that there was someone following me. I crossed the street, followed again. And then I realized, oh, wow, there's actually someone who's now been essentially stalking me for about 4 blocks now. And I need to gun for a major street. So I ran to the closest major street, which is Parliament. And I really had no idea what was happening to me. It's just like, it felt like it was happening so quickly. Turns out there was a guy who actually lives in our community. I had a sign, and the sign said, "Asian woman, go home." And I actually had no idea how to react. So I basically went to like a crowd, and the only 2 people who came to support me, first was a gay man and his partner, and the second was a Black woman. And meanwhile, this is a busy street. There's like 20 people around, and no one else, no one else, Asian or white, really stepped up to try to address the situation. It lasted for about another 15 or so minutes. The entire time, it's been now a couple of months, I don't even really remember all the words that were exchanged. I literally said nothing during the entire incident, not a word. The only thing I did was I pulled up my phone because I was like, oh my God, I have to file a police report. So I pulled up my phone just to start to record the situation. And he flipped over the sign and he had a different message specific to recording. And I just thought to myself, oh my God, here's someone in my community has clearly done this before, so premeditated. It's crazy. And thankfully, one of the guy who stepped in to with such grace, by the way, I just want to give a good, really quick shout out to the LGBTQ community, as well as the other people of color who have dealt with this their entire lives. They know exactly what to do and how to de-escalate. And thankfully, he walked me partially home, and then my husband walked me the other part of the way home. But honestly, even to this day, every time I walk outside, I do a 360 check. If I've been walking for more than 3 minutes and I haven't looked around me, I have hairs that kind of raise up on my skin, and it's it's just I still don't really know what to do with all of this. So all I can say is thank you for all of you for hearing my story, and for Jessie for providing the opportunity for this for me to share, because it's definitely been a part of the healing journey. So thanks all.
Thank you, Jenny. Breathing with you. The listening is harder than the speaking. It's my turn to go next. Sorry for the delay. Okay, the story that I want to share with you, which relates to how Jenny grew up feeling as well, and is how a lot of Asian kids grow up feeling. So I grew up in Saskatoon. And for those who are in Australia, New Zealand, or most likely in the US, it's a small city in Western Canada. And when I was growing up, I think the Chinese population was less than 1%. And when I was growing up, I was really ashamed to be Chinese and to be Asian. And in my first, a new skill I'm working on is crying and talking at the same time. It's very hard to read. In my first elementary school, I was one of 3 non-white kids out of hundreds. And on Saturdays, like a lot of immigrant kids, I would go to Chinese school. And once a year at my elementary school, assembly, where anyone who participated in a foreign language school would come up to the front of the room and receive a certificate for their participation. As an adult, you would think this is great. You know, you should be proud of your heritage and proud of your being able to speak another language. And as a child, I dreaded this assembly all year long for years. Every time I heard there was an announcement on the intercom, I was like, I hope it's not that assembly. That is the level of shame and I felt about being Asian and being different. And my mom's on the call. I'm really grateful that she doesn't remember this, but I remember that when I was 6, I once looked up at my mom and I said, Mommy, why don't I have blonde hair and blue eyes? And I've carried so much guilt for asking her that question throughout my entire life. And it wasn't until I got to university and I learned more about social and racial justice that I learned about this term called internalized racism, internalized racial oppression. And it's what happens when a member of a minority or a person of color internalizes the racist beliefs that white supremacy holds and feels that way about themselves. And what was difficult for me growing up is that it wasn't just that I didn't see Asian people in politics and on TV and in the media. I just didn't see that many Asian people around me growing up in Saskatoon. And when I learned about internalized racial oppression, I really felt a sense of relief because my whole life up until that point, I'd felt so much guilt about that. And I learned that this desire for blonde hair and blue eyes, this desire for whiteness and proximity to whiteness is actually a very common experience among children of color, especially if you grow up in a really white dominated society. And last summer on our racial justice working group, as we started off with core definitions. And when we got to internalized racial oppression, I put up my hand because I wanted to share my personal story, lots of tears like just now. And I wanted to elucidate for the white women on the call, what does this term actually mean? And what does it look like with someone they know? And what's the impact it can have on a child? And I was really moved. There was such an outpouring of support in the chat like there is right now. Thank you so much, everyone. And what really stood out to me was I received several direct messages from Asian women who had grown up in Canada before me, sharing that they felt the exact same way growing up. And one of those women was Suzanne. And it just really pains me to think that Suzanne felt that way growing up, that I felt that way growing up. And because of the culture and system of white supremacy, there's a whole generation of Asian kids, brown kids, and other kids of color who are growing up feeling that same way too. Thank you for listening. So with that, we're going to transition now to talk a little bit about those systems and the history that got us here. Because while there has been a massive spike of anti-Asian hate crimes in the last year, and I think a huge part of that has been Trump's very hateful rhetoric calling COVID-19 the China virus, as we've all heard. That being said, anti-Asian racism is nothing new, and there's a long history of it in Canada and the US. So Suzanne, I'm going to pass it to you to start us off again. We'd love to hear, for those who aren't from Canada and even Canadians, if you can share what the Chinese head tax was and how your family was impacted by it.
Thanks. Yeah, this is hard. And I will also say that I'm not naturally a crier. And actually, if anything, when I'm upset, I feel more fierce. I feel more angry. And so when I tell this story about the Chinese Exclusion Act, I just feel really proud of my grandparents and my parents having endured this. And that's sort of how I want to preface this. In the late 1800s, 1880 to 1885, over 15,000 Chinese laborers came to Canada and British Columbia in particular to finish the CPR railway. And when the railway was done, they needed work. And the white workers were incredibly angry and fearful that Chinese folks would take away their work. So they lobbied the federal government and said, we need to stop this immigration. And it passed. This immigration passed in 1885, and it was called the Chinese Immigration Act, but really it was the Exclusion Act, and it prevented Chinese people from immigrating into Canada, or it made it extremely difficult. And my grandfather was one of those persons who did come to Canada and immigrated, but he was denied a lot of rights and privileges, and it was exposed to an incredible amount of racism that I never talked to him about. I only inferred it and learned it, bits and pieces from my father. And he was one of thousands of people who paid a head tax, and it started out, it was recommended, I understand, at $10. It was implemented at $50, and it raised to $500 within a few years. And the federal government raised an equivalent of, in today's dollars, over $1.2 billion, collecting money from Chinese immigrants to deter them from coming. And this $500 was essentially 2 years worth of work in terms of salary for my grandfather. And it prevented him from bringing his family to Canada because he couldn't afford another $500. What he did do is he went back to China, got married, had my father, and I just came to the realization my father grew up with no father for most of his life until he had the opportunity to come to Canada when he was 18, when the Immigration Act was finally repealed. And so I think about how hard it was, and I have a different story from my mom, which I won't get into, but how hard it was for these immigrants to come to Canada, not have a relationship with their parents, come to a new country, learn a new language, and be exposed to an incredible amount of racism. And all I can say is I'm just really proud of how they endured and how they were able to face those hurdles and find success and raise us in a way that we were able to succeed and thrive. And realize that that system of oppression began so long ago, and it empowered folks to continue using that form of oppression to continue be bold and brazen and do the things that are happening now around hate crimes. And it's up to us to kind of expose the history and expose the fear that people had and call it what it is and find ways to dismantle them and say, this is about fear, this is about losing something, or maybe this is about mental health and fixing those problems, because we're never going to fix them until we actually get to the root cause of what's causing it. So that's what I tweeted about today. I thought long and hard about it, and we'll talk about ways to kind of overcome them and remedies, but I just wanted to share that history. And and the final piece that again I'm super proud of is they did redress this in 2006, and I think it was that was the year, and the Harper government did issue an apology, and they did have a redressment. And my grandmother was one of maybe less than 50 people still alive to receive that redressment, and it wasn't granted to anyone who had already passed and didn't have a spouse, so the children didn't benefit. And so when that letter came, my aunts and my father were just so proud to receive that apology, and just to kind of acknowledge that and just receive that recognition. And I just want to honor the folks that did not receive that or had passed. And that's just a part of history that I'm angry about, but I'm also really proud about. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Janice, I'm going to pass it to you next.
So I'd like to talk about Japanese Canadians. I'm a third generation Japanese Canadian. So my parents and my grandparents were born in Canada. And so I'll start with 1907. And in 1907, there was this big riot in Vancouver, which resulted in residents rioting and destroying the property of Asians. So in response, the government limited the immigration from Japan to 400 people per year. They reduced it to 150 per year in 1928. And during the Second World War, I would say that the what happened to Japanese Canadians is one of the most tragic events that could happen in Canada's history. Japanese Canadians were forcibly taken out of their homes and confined. 21,000 Japanese Canadians were taken from their homes on Canada's west coast without any charge or due process. They were just given a notice saying, report here and take whatever you can carry. And these displaced Canadians included my parents and both their families who were born in Canada. 12,000 were exiled to remote areas of British Columbia and Northern Ontario work camps. And the Northern Ontario work camps were for some of the, most of the younger men who resisted. One of them was my father, and they were quite tough, Northern Ontario, doing logging and a very, very extreme environment. And the camps that the families went to were in the interior of BC, and they were really abandoned towns and things like that, where they just tried to make do. A lot of the places didn't have running water. And so the federal government stripped all the Japanese Canadians of all their property. And then at the end of the war, they pressured many of them to accept mass deportation, even though the majority were born in Canada. But a lot of the Japanese Canadians left because they couldn't believe this could happen to a Canadian. So those who remained in Canada were not allowed to resettle on the West Coast. They were told to go east, go anywhere but the West Coast, until I think it was 5 years later, they could go back to the West Coast. And that's how my family ended up, who had roots in Vancouver and Vancouver Island, ended up here in Toronto. So this whole knowledge of this, I never heard this at all from my parents. My parents never talked about this. If you ask them about it, eventually when it did come out, they would say, well, maybe it was better because that's how we ended up in Toronto and we're having a good life here and everything. So one of the things that when you go through that sort of a rerouting, it's absolutely incredible how you have to have the resiliency to move on, to actually make a life and move on. And so I would say that that's what I'm most proud of, is the way my parents and their families moved on, were able to be remembering they all started from scratch again to provide for their families and for our generation, and our kids all go to university and have great careers and successes. In 1988, similar to the Chinese Canadians, the federal government officially apologized for its treatment of Japanese Canadians. That was the Mulroney government, and made a redress payment to any who had survived, and then allocated some money to a community fund. So it's something that is being studied way more now in terms of what happened there in the socialization. But as we've been saying on this call, this is about systemic bias and systemic racism. It's not something that just came up this year because of COVID. And that's why I'm so involved at trying to get at these systemic fixes to make this happen. And it is through systems like racial justice and social justice, because we have to change the dialogue and we have to provide aids for people who don't have equal access to what we take for granted. So I know that's a bit of a downer, so I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jessie. Sorry.
No, please don't apologize. And thank you for sharing the history and how your family was impacted with everyone. Jenny, I'm going to pass it to you next.
Thanks. Don't worry, Janice. I'm going to continue to be a downer, so it's all good. So I thought I would just share some highlights from just my own deep dive in terms of just understanding history from my lens, which is largely looking at it from a largely China and US lens. So I'm going to start by just saying there's a great quote by Kishore Mahbubani, a Singaporean diplomat. He said, "It is virtually an iron law of history that a country's attitude towards other countries is influenced by its history." And so I just wanted you to keep that in mind as I go through a couple points. So I didn't even know this was a thing, but China went through this thing called the Century of Humiliation, and it happened between 1842 to 1945. At the same time, America went through the Century of Triumph from 1890 to 1945. So two completely different things happening in parallel. In China during that period, basically China literally lost almost all of the wars, economic, war, combat-based, literally lost all of their wars. That was, so they made concessions and they just lost everything. So that was kind of the backdrop of what was happening during that century. Meanwhile, in the US, American production had reached all-time highs. I think at the time, like US was producing 50% of the world's goods, otherwise known as the golden age of capitalism. And actually, during that time, even though the US didn't participate in any early Western attacks on China during those wars, they did make sure that they were not disadvantaged through this most favored nation principle, which basically means that whatever territorial or trading concessions that Western powers acquired from China, that the US would also benefit. And so this was kind of the status quo until really about 2000 to 2010. And there's kind of two major events that took place that really changed the whole ecosystem. So first thing was the 2008 financial crisis. And so Chinese officials became very arrogant and condescending towards the US after this moment. And also the US Treasury set teams to request China not to stop buying US Treasury bills. So that's kind of one thing that happened. Second thing that happened was along the lines of elections. So first was the election of President Xi Jinping in November 2012. He's like a very firm, decisive person who provided a new strategic direction to China, particularly from a foreign policy standpoint. At the same time, we also had shortly after the election of Donald Trump, which was kind of like the exact opposite, very unpredictable, and arguably made very unstrategic decisions when it came to foreign policy. And it was actually in 2018, and I feel like this went completely under the radar for so many people. In 2018, the Trump administration decided to launch a trade war to China. And since then, there's been no shortage of anti-China speeches from the administration, as Jesse, you have shared. But of course, China's at fault too, like absolutely, they alienated through this process part of the business community as well, through just like the lack of transparency with the regulatory environment as an example. And so now we're in this actually very intense and deep trade war, and there's actually a broader question at play, which is what happens now? And there's a huge and real risk of this tension escalating into a full-on war. And I just wanted to bring awareness to this because I feel like it's just missing so much in our dialogue. And so one of the things that I feel is that, well, going back to the quote I shared initially, how our attitudes are influenced by our own history, I do think that part of what we need to do is reconcile this period of humiliation and this period of triumph and the fact that these two realities are happening at the same time in order for us to productively move forward. So just wanted to share that. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks so much, Jenny. And one factor that I want to bring to light is the role that media and culture and entertainment plays in perpetuating harmful stereotypes about Asian people. So we've heard from Suzanne and Janice, who talked about the history from the Canadian side. And for any Americans on the call, we'll also be sharing a resource list at the end where you can do a deeper dive. Jenny has now talked about some of the political tensions, and I also want to shed some light on the role that media plays. So when you start paying attention, like speaking from my personal experience, when you start paying attention to how Asian people are portrayed in the media, honestly, it's quite shocking that from my experience, almost every role that I've seen has some element of perpetuating a stereotype. And in Hollywood, there's actually a very long history. It used to be the norm that white people would play Asian characters. This is called yellowface. And when that happened, it often came with exaggerated accents, exaggerated makeup and features, and often, especially in the earlier days, portraying Asian people as conniving, as sneaky, as untrustworthy, and the perpetual foreigner. This goes back to Fu Manchu, all the way to Breakfast at Tiffany's, to most recently, Scarlett Johansson came under fire in 2017 for playing a Japanese character. And I was just reading, I just found this study that this article in the New York Times that had done this analysis of the 1,300 top grossing films from 2007 to 2019. And of those 1,300 films, 40% have 0 Asian or Pacific Islander speaking characters, period. Of the 60% who do have at least one speaking character who's Asian or Pacific Islander, 2/3 of those characters were confirmed in this study to be perpetuating racialized stereotypes about Asian people. So taking a step back, that means that, over the last decade plus, the majority of media representation of Asian people in TV and film has been problematic. And typically what we see when we start paying attention is that Asian men in media and in film are portrayed as geeky, as unattractive, as effeminate. And on the flip side, Asian women are often portrayed as hypersexualized, hyperfeminine, exotic, and fetishized. And when those murders happened in Georgia in March, 6 of the 8 were Asian women. Several academics and scholars pointed to the longstanding portrayal of Asian women as hypersexualized and as fetishized as contributing to a factor that contributed to those really gruesome murders. And so I invite you to start paying attention and to think critically when you see Asian people in media and to think about how they're being portrayed. Are they being portrayed in a way that perpetuates and reinforces these harmful stereotypes? Or in the minority of cases, is it a representation that is holistic and multidimensional and has different aspects that emulate human life? And so with that, it's a good transition into talking about what actions we can take. So heightening our awareness and our consciousness. And we're now going to go around and share some actions as well, what we can do to address anti-Asian racism in our families, in our workplaces, and in our communities. And Janice, you have been extremely active, as she started to share, over the last year, forming the Coalition of Asian Canadians, which led to that incredible video that we got to watch. And I also want to take a moment, Janice is very humble, but I want to give her a very huge and public shout out. Janice recently donated $1 million through Ryerson University to set up a chair in racial justice to combat anti-Asian racism. So thank you, Janice, for being such an incredible leader and inspiration. And please inspire us. Tell us, what can we do for everyone on this call to address what's happening?
Thank you, Jessie, and thank you for that call out. I think that one of the things we realize is that, and these activities might sound boring, but they're absolutely necessary to change the systemic bias. One of them is about education. In our education system, if you go to school in Canada, you learn about North American history and European history. Well, we're saying, what about Asian history? Asia has a rich history. If you look at the demographics of Canada, over 50% is Asia. There are 40 countries in Asia, not just 1 or 2. And so we're working through Asia Pacific Foundation, who already has a module that they're trying out in the Vancouver primary and mid-level schools, which is excellent. So make it core, because when you learn a lot about the history, you'll be more accepting of people. You can ask questions and then actually feel the whole strength of Canada being a nation that's built on immigration as well as internal growth. The other education is for our businesses and our corporations and generally the people today to know about what Chenny was talking about, the growing importance of Asian economies to the future of Canada's economic growth. Because right now, we know that the demographics of Asia are ramping up in terms of middle class and spend compared to North America and Europe. So in order for us to be successful there and for us, everyone here at SheEO and on the call to export there, we have to learn more about the culture and how to do business with Asia. And then, and so those are some of the longer term media watch. We need to do media watch because as you said, Jenny, the media forms the opinions. And we need more active media watch on social media, and that's so that everyone can see where the trends are forming, and then get into this before it gets out of control. And so a lot of this is embodied in this one activity that I'm going to put a shout out to, Jesse, and it's through UBC, and we're working with UBC. Santa Ono, the president of UBC, is on our coalition, and UBC is hosting a virtual national forum on anti-Asian racism, and it's national, it's virtual, it's open to anyone who wants to sign up for this. And the first day is all about some plenaries, but breakout groups about identifying what the issues are by sector or by industry, and then trying to figure out what we can do to actually improve this, and what's the game plan going forward. So I don't know if we put the invitation up, but if we didn't, I'll send you, Jenny. I think I forgot to send it to you. And it's happening in 2 weeks, and I encourage you, if you have any time at all, to just dial into it to see, because it's about, this issue is for Canadians. This is not just about Asian Canadians, and that's what we're trying to do. So that's just briefly, and I don't want to use up all the time, so I'm turning it back to you, Jesse.
Thank you so much, Janice. And thank you, Laurel, who added the link in the chat for the UBC National Dialogue event. So check that out in the chat. Jenny, I'm going to pass it to you next.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, I think just building on Janice's points, it's really just learning about the history as a good starting point. And specifically for my fellow Asian sisters, I would encourage you to actually interview your parents and grandparents if they're still alive about their experiences. There's so much richness there. And I can definitely say I have gotten to know my intergenerational trauma much deeper through these interviews and conversations, and therefore have empowered myself to start to unpack some of that trauma in a productive way. So that's one thing. And then I think the other thing for me, particularly just based on my recent lived experience, is it's just like educate yourself as to what you should do to de-escalate a situation when you see racism happening in front of you. You know, and also as a person who is experiencing it, like what you should do in that moment too. Just so you feel that you're equipped with the tools that you need should you ever need to use them. So yeah, those would be my 2 quick cents. Back to you, Jesse.
Thanks, Jenny. And we're going to be sharing a resource list at the end of the call today, as well as in the follow-up email with some links, bystander intervention training workshops, other resources to learn more. Suzanne, I'll pass it to you next.
Yeah, a huge shout out to the Hollaback bystander intervention training workshop that I took. I learned so much, and there's just some easy, accessible resources to learn how to intervene in a safe way, and as simple as dropping something on the floor to de-escalate the situation that's happening. Like, honestly, there's so many practical things. And what I've done with that too is leveraged it to have conversations with my kids and equip them with some tools to say, like, if you see this happening at school, this is some tips of things you can do. And the other thing is to, like, I'm married to a white person, and he is a wonderful person, very compassionate, but he doesn't see racism from his eyes, obviously, because he doesn't experience it. And so being able to share with him these tips and say, this is what it's like, and reminding my kids, because they are half white, like, this is the privilege that you have, and just gently sharing with them stories and ways that they can be strong allies is a really valuable thing that I've been doing quite recently. And then the other thing, the final thing I'll share is, and I mentioned this in my tweet today, is that recently there was a really violent attack on people in our neighborhood in North Vancouver. And I noticed a huge outpouring of support. The community gathered, and there was money collected and resource collected. And I just noticed around me, like, there's so much action. And it made me realize that the proximity to the violence or the danger, or like it could have been me, that is what incites people to action. And my advice is don't wait till it's in your neighborhood or it could have been me. Like, you can do it now, and you can take this bystander intervention training. You can share and shout out resources. You can act by voting or lobbying or doing whatever calls out to you. So there's so much you can do, whether it's small steps or big steps, like what Janice is doing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. And from my end, in terms of actions we can take, I really encourage everyone on this call to use your platform. I mentioned earlier that seeing Suzanne's posts inspired me to start sharing. And I feel like one of my takeaways from that is realizing that we all have a platform. We all have a voice. We all have more influence and power than we probably realize. And so the importance of speaking out about that. The other thing that I wanted to highlight as well is over the last 2 months, I've had a lot of conversations with family, with friends, and with our amazing SheEO team coworkers as well about anti-Asian racism. And I want to give a shout out to my in-laws who are on the call today. In March, when the murders first happened, my partner is also white and his family didn't reach out to me. And it was hard to put into words what I was experiencing, and it hurt. And I had many conversations with his family about it. And my in-laws who are on the call today, I was really nervous to talk to them about it. It was the first time that we were talking about race and white privilege. And honestly, they just reacted with so much love and support. And the fact that they're on this call today says all you need to know. And they have really amplified what I've been sharing and talked to their families about it. I received cards and messages from aunts and uncles. It's really been an outpouring of support. And that is an example of a conversation that went really well and was very powerful. And I've also had some conversations over the last 2 months that have been very difficult, and it hasn't been received as well. But I would say that looking back, having had many of these conversations, even the difficult ones, I don't regret them at all. Because, for me as an individual, if there's anything I can do, if I can inspire one white person to start thinking about white privilege and the systems of racial oppression that we live in, like, my work here is done. Like, that is what I commit to. And I'm happy to do that work. And so I feel like one of the things that I've really learned and reflected from this experience is just how important it is to talk to those who are closest in our lives, family, friends, coworkers, and to start having these really honest conversations. At SheEO, we often talk about how transforming systems start with transforming ourselves. And I do think that this work, this personal work that's often extremely uncomfortable, is really where we need to start. And so thank you, everyone who is on our call today. You've taken the first step already to be here and to listen to these stories and to our experiences. And I encourage you all to continue to look inward. And so we have a few minutes before I want to share some resources and some final words. So we've noticed there's been a lot of support and kindness and compassion in the chat. Not so many questions. I'm wondering, following the energy here, if anyone might like to share a comment. Oh, Fang, you have your hand raised if you want to come off mute.
Oh, hello, can you hear me? Yes, yeah, so hi, I am in Singapore now. Yeah, and I missed the first half of the conversation because I woke up late. Yeah, but anyway, I just thought it would be good to enrich the conversation. So the point that I want to make is that there's also anti-Asian racism within Asia. Yeah, so in Singapore, which is my hometown, I was aware that I had Chinese privilege because the Chinese is the majority race in Singapore. So while I know that the non-majority races, they experience different things from me, I don't really know it until I experience it. So my solution was a bit extreme. I thought I had to replicate it by being a minority. So I moved to Vancouver to do my master's and experience life there. And while I like a lot of things there, I can say for sure that it is really hard and discouraging to be a minority. Yeah, so anyway, my point is just that it was very effective to make me a more empathetic individual, because now I am back in Singapore. So I think I can at least relate more to the minority races. Yeah, and my point is just to enrich the conversation in that there are different kinds of racism in different places. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sang, for sharing that. And I do want to acknowledge we have people today on our call from all around the world, and anti-Asian racism does look different in other countries. And so if you're not based in Canada or the US, I encourage you to do some research and to find out about the history in your local region. We have time for one more comment. So Yemi, I think that you had your hand up next.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you all very, very much. It is a comment because it's probably a loaded one, but I know we all have a story, but feel incredibly blessed to hear a different side of the story. And I guess what I'd love to do and learn more about SheEO is how can we as the collective who have shared experiences of being alienated come together? Because the more I hear our different stories, the more I realize that we're not actually the minority, we are the majority. And so I'm interested to learn more and will definitely reach out. But thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Yemi. And I think that's a great question. Let's all think about that together and invite you to become part of the SheEO community as well. So we just have a couple of minutes. Renee is going to share the link in the chat, but we have put together a few resources. If you're interested in learning more and doing a deeper dive into the history, whether you're based in Canada, the US, also had a few links in here for Australia and New Zealand, but if you're based in Singapore, etc., encourage you to learn more about what the local context is. There's a link to the Eyes Open PSA video. Would love for everyone on this call to amplify and share that, and other resources as well to take action, whether it's talking to your kids, your family about racism, signing up for a bystander intervention training, making donations, etc. And so Renee is also going to share a link to a feedback form. We would love to hear your reflections on today's session. This is the first time we're doing this type of learning circle. And I was very, very nervous for this. So I really appreciate everyone creating such an open and welcoming and supportive environment to allow us to share our very personal stories. Within the link in the reflection form, there's also a space to share. If you'd like to share an action that you're committing to taking, we would love to hear that as well. And last but not least, to Yemi's point, I would be remiss not to share the opportunity. If you are a guest on this call and you are new to SheEO and you'd like to be part of a community where we do talk about social and racial justice and we commit to transforming ourselves and systems, we invite you to learn more about becoming an activator and being part of our community. Before we go, I want to express my heartfelt and deep gratitude to Suzanne, Janice, and Chenny. Thank you all so much for being here with us, for sharing your courage and your leadership and your inspiration. It's been an honor. And thank you everyone on this call today. This has been a really meaningful experience for me personally, and I'm so, so grateful to have shared this with you all. Thank you so much, and hope you have a great rest of your evening and or day.
Thank you.